Welcome to Wildlife at Our Feet. Meet your snail and insect neighbors with the Natural History Museum. This program is brought to you by the Library Foundation and Edison International. So your mics and video will be disabled during this event. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box that will be on your screen. We'll do our best to include you in the question and answer session. Please ensure that your chat, when you enter a message, is set to all panelists so that we can see your questions. If you have any problems with your sound or video, please let us know in the chat. If you're having trouble with your audio, we have included a US toll that you can call into to listen over the phone. And I'll be including that in our chat as well. So to learn more about our virtual programs, you can sign up for our weekly e-newsletter, or you can also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at LA County Library. I'm Rachel Hadlock-Peltz, the Children's Librarian at Hawthorne Library, and I will be your host for today. Today's program, we are joined by Jan Vendetti and Lisa Gonzalez, and they work for the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. And so to give a little background on them, Jan is an associate curator of Malecology, the study of mollusks at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. And she is interested in the natural history, evolution, systematics, and conservation of marine and terrestrial snails, an extremely diverse group of organisms. Lisa Gonzalez joined the BioScan project in 2012 as an assistant collections manager. She received a BS in entomology from UC Riverside. She considers the museum her second home in Los Angeles. She first started as a volunteer back in 2001 at the museum's insect zoo. Through the BioScan project, she had the great pleasure and honor of helping uncover insect biodiversity in the backyards and shared green spaces across LA, including new species previously unknown to science. Her insect macro photography is featured in the exhibit Spiky, Hairy, Shiny, Insects of Los Angeles. So without further ado, here is Jan Vendetti.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Can I get a thumbs up from maybe Rachel or Lisa, just that you can hear me okay? Super. Okay. So I'm so excited. I study snails, and so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about snails today. And Lisa, my colleague, is going to help me with slides. So I think she's going to share some slides right now so I can show you some pictures of some of the things that I study, and so you can have a bit of a virtual tour through Malecology. So when Rachel introduced me, she used that word. She said, Lisa, you could go to the next slide if you don't mind. She said the word Malecology. So this is what my office door looks like. So if you went to the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County and you went not to the exhibits, but to the research floor, which is generally off limits to the public. So it's a very special experience to be able to do that. This is what my door looks like. So Malecology is a big word. Ology means the study of. Malecology is the study of mollusks. There's an interesting story about the Greek origin of that word that I think I'll skip for today. But in any case, this is what I study, and it's a magnificent group of organisms. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview of what I do and why I study what I study, and then I'm happy to answer your questions at the end. Okay, Lisa, next slide, please. So if you were to go into the behind the scenes view of the Malecology collection in the city of Los Angeles at the Natural History Museum, it would look like this. So not like this, it would look exactly like this. This is what it looks like. A collection is very different than an exhibit, right? An exhibit is what you have in your collection on display so that people can learn about it. The collection itself is organized to allow researchers to use it and scientists to use it. So you can think of it, I mean, it's so appropriate that Rachel gave us an introduction as a children's librarian, because she's used to organizing and thinking about organizing books, and our collections are organized specimens. So it's almost the same thing. Instead of having shelves of books, we have these cabinets of specimens. Lisa, next slide, please. And if you were to pull out a drawer, right? So think of that as maybe a shelf. If you were to pull out a drawer, it might look like this. So these are some of my favorite marine snails. And this is what a drawer of these snails might look like. So just a little bit of background information. The museum was established in 1813. So we are over, as an institution, we're over 100 years old. There's about 35 million objects or specimens in the whole museum. That's all of the collections. Malecology has about between 4 and 5 million specimens. So that means shells, individual shells, or slugs, or what have you, or squid, a kind of mollusk. And then 15 organismal departments. That means the department that Lisa's in, entomology, my department, mollusks, mammals, arthropods, things like that. 20 curators, those are the lead scientists on research projects, with other staff who do lots of research, like assistant collections managers and research scientists. And importantly, we think of this collection as a library of biodiversity. So like a library, like I said before, is for books, we think of our collection as this library of biodiversity. And I'm going to discuss biodiversity in just a minute. Next slide, please, Lisa. There are about 100,000 species of mollusks. So I use this slide to kind of give people a general sense of what we're talking about. So mollusks are the most famous mollusks, maybe, are the clams and snails, or maybe the most familiar. So this is just a snapshot of some beautiful artist depiction of North American seashells. So you can see these at the beach, but you can also see mollusks on land. Next slide, please. And the most species-rich group, or the group within the mollusks that has the most members, are the gastropods, and these are the snails and slugs. So those are the friends in this slide that are circled in yellow. So those are freshwater snails and marine and terrestrial or land-living snails and slugs. Next slide, please. And I'm showing birds here on the top and mammals on the bottom because I want to make a comparison of numbers. So the last slide said that there were about 100,000 mollusks, right? And so that's hard to know how many is 100,000 species. And it's helpful, I think, to compare it to another group. So there are between, let's say, 10 and 15,000 bird species. So 10 and 15,000 birds, there are 100,000 mollusks species. And then mammals, which might be the group that most people are most familiar with. So, right, dogs, elephants, us, chimps, gorillas, rabbits, like everything that's a mammal, there are only about 5,000. So comparatively, the mollusks are a really big group. But Lisa might tell you that they are dwarfed by the insects. So the insects are a huge group, but the mollusks are the second biggest. Okay, next slide. And they can be found in a lot of different environments. So this is an intertidal environment that we have in California, right? A tide pool. Next slide. And there can be highly, highly diverse. So one of the first research experiences I had studying intertidal mollusks, which are found up and down the coast of California, was when I was a postdoc. So that was after I got my PhD. Then I did a research program at Cal State LA, in which go Golden Eagles. And right in that picture, if you can see the color, I'm like face right almost to my nose in a greenish brown mud, and the green is an algae called Vaucheria, and within that algae are tiny little sea slugs that I was studying with a scientist at Cal State LA. So that was one of my first really in-depth experiences with studying some of your California slug biodiversity. Next slide, please. And just to give you a little sense of what biodiversity means is it's the variety of species in an environment. So this is a sea slug. This is called Thuradilla picta. You can go to the next slide. This biodiversity means, although this is a beautiful, remarkable sea slug, if we have an environment that only has this sea slug, that would be low biodiversity. Next slide. But if we think about how you could add different individuals to this environment, right? Now you can see that there are 5 other sea slugs, which would make it a high biodiversity environment. So usually a very healthy environment has a lot of biodiversity. And what we want to do at the museum is have representation of that biodiversity in our collections. So for example, we wouldn't want to have 20 individuals of one species and no individuals of this other species. We would want to be able to study many different species within a habitat to understand the biodiversity of that particular place. Next slide. And just to give you a sense of your of the terrestrial mollusca in all of the biodiversity of terrestrial mollusca, that means land snails. There are about 40,000 species. So remember our, let's say 15,000 birds, our 5,000 mammals, our 100,000 mollusks. Of that 100,000 mollusks, 40,000 are land snails and slugs, which is a huge group. Again, a really, really big group, 40,000 species. So it's a lot for a lot of opportunity for researchers to study many, many different species because so much is unknown about so many species. And I found while living in Los Angeles that so much of our own biodiversity is understudied, meaning that a lot of what lives around us is not well known. And some of its basic natural history, so how it reproduces, what times of year is it active, how long does it live, things like that aren't very well known. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so another thing that when we're interested in thinking about local local habitats and the organisms that live there, it's important to think about that biodiversity, right? How many species are living in a particular environment, and then where they're distributed. So where that particular species is found. You can go to the next slide. And we have some very unusual habitats in California that are found here and nowhere else. So this, for example, is Joshua Tree, or this is Saddleback Butte State Park, including Joshua trees. So the desert east of us. You can go to the next slide. The San Gabriel Mountains National Monument. So up just sort of north and east of Los Angeles, the habitat in the San Gabriels is unique and remarkable. And there's different snails that live there than anywhere else in the world. You can go to the next slide. Likewise, in our very urban and developed city of Los Angeles, there are a lot of species that live and are reliant on the habitats that we create as humans. So I'll talk just a touch about those. You can go to the next slide. And so some examples of the species that live in Los Angeles that you may, or Los Angeles County in Southern California that you might not be familiar with. This is a little snail called Cockless Alababra. So that's its scientific name. It's a European species. You can go to the next slide. There's some more pictures of this. This snails was known from Southern California for at least 80 years or so. But community scientists, so people contributing photographs of snails and slugs to the platform Inaturalist, found this species, and it hadn't been observed in San Diego County since the 1960s. So if you can see on the left, there's the picture on the left, there's a larger snail, and then if you look carefully, they're like little brownish tan little things, and on closer inspection, those are these tiny, tiny little snails. So you could fit like 1 or 2 of them on your pinky nail. They're very small. Their history in Los Angeles and Southern California hasn't been very well documented. So I've been kind of keeping track of that. Sometimes these introduced species can be agricultural pests, so they can be problematic for our crops and gardens, and they can become a nuisance. So it's important to keep tabs on them. You can go to the next slide, please. Here's some more pictures. This is within the iNaturalist platform. These are different people taking, showing photos of them. So iNaturalist is a really great resource for learning about local biodiversity. You can go to the next slide. This is a species, these two slugs. If you were to see a slug in Los Angeles, it would be very likely be one of these two species. They've got a big genus name. That's that scientific name on the top. It's Ambigolimax. There are two species, Valentianus on the bottom left and Nyctelius on the bottom right. And Nyctelius was, they don't, maybe this picture makes them look a little bit different, but they're very, they are almost impossible to tell apart by just looking at them from their appearance. So we have to do DNA tests to figure out who's who. And doing a DNA test, we figured out that Nyctelius lived in Los Angeles for the very first time. So it's also an introduced species we didn't know lived here until we actually did the science to figure it out. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Helmintoglypta trasci. This is one of your local Los Angeles snails. This genus, the big name, the big scientific name, Helmintoglypta, there are at least 3 species that live in Los Angeles, and they are endemic, and they are from here. They are species that are native to Southern California and are found here and nowhere else. So if you find a snail that is amber to golden brown colored with one single band, you can see it's single band here. That is a native snail. It won't eat your garden. It won't bother you. It's just trying to survive in a very difficult environment. If you live in urban Los Angeles, if you live up close to the foothills, that's where they like to live. And it's a really interesting species that doesn't have a lot of science that's been done on it. So, so myself and some colleagues are working on learning much more about this species. You can go to the next slide. Here's what iNaturalist would look like, or what iNaturalist does look like if you look up the Trask shoulder-band snail, or its common name.
Jan, we do have a question about single band. What is the single band? What do we mean by that?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So you can, thank you. So you can see it on this slide too. If you look carefully, a band like a line on the shell. So in some of these photos, it's maybe more easy to see than others. But if you imagine just a snail shell, there's one single line, colored line, that's on this shell. And I'll show a different species that looks a little bit like it, that does not have a single band, that you could probably tell the difference. But the shoulder band snail just has one single colored ring or band on the shell as just a colored darker brown color. Thank you for that question. You can go to the next slide. This is a species called Theba paisana. This is a European species. Usually when you see a lot of individuals all in one place, it's an indication that they are from somewhere else and they have very few to no natural predators here. So this is what's happening with Theba paisana. This is an Italian to sort of circum-Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean Sea species, and it loves living in Southern California, but it is what we would consider a nuisance species. So you can go to the next slide. And this is just a series of pictures. You can just flip through them, Lisa, of this snail in abundance. And some colleagues and I have been studying the snail to learn more about it. This is just a map of how you could through iNaturalist figure out what the distribution is of a particular species. So here you can see us in California, in Southern California. You could also see that this species is found in Europe, in parts of South America, South Africa, and Australia. You can go to the next slide. This is a little cute friend. This slug is probably around the size of your thumbnail. It's called the garden Aryan. It is from the British Isles. It's also a visitor here. It wasn't known to live here until about 5 years ago. It's not known whether it is problematic for the habitats that it lives in. It could be neutral. It could just be a new member of that particular environment, or it could have some sort of problematic effect. We don't really know yet. But it's an interesting sort of natural experiment that it's living in Southern California, but only in places that are well watered because of people's lawns. So this is one sort of side effect or consequence of us having created particular environments for our plants and trees and things that we'd like to have around that also allow the persistence of other species, and sometimes from around the world. Okay, can you go to the next slide? Glyptostoma gabrielense, I mentioned that the San Gabriel now National Monument is a remarkable habitat that has many native species. This is one of them. Very little is known about this species biology. San Gabriel chestnut snail is about the size of a quarter, and it's likely, it's thought that it is likely an endangered species. So having that habitat set aside such that there can't be development or tremendous change to that environment is good news for this species. Okay, and then I think the next few are just wrap-up slides. Let's see, can you go through? Oh, Cornue spursum, just two more. This is one species. Cornue spursum is the common European garden snail. This is the most common species you'll see in Southern California. You can see it has kind of a band, but it can be highly variable in shell. The next species is a species that was brought, it's called the decolate snail. It was brought to Southern California to eat Cornue spursum in citrus groves at least 100 years ago, but it's now quite common elsewhere. And then I think you can maybe one or two more, and then I'll wrap up. And then these are species that don't live here, but are found in Mexico, Texas, and Hawaii, which are introduced and potentially invasive snails that we don't want to have here because they can have problematic repercussions for other species. And I think with that, I'll say goodbye with this little friend. This is a native Los Angeles slug. So there is only one species of slug that's native to our part of Southern California. And it's pretty rare, but this little friend was found in Griffith Park. So this is another good reason that we have habitat set aside for native species. And with that, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Jan. And we did have a question in the comments about snails' shells and whether they change their shells, and if so, how often, or if they just keep growing.
Yes, so yeah, they just keep growing. So if you think, sometimes I explain it like, think of a turtle. A turtle has a shell and it grows with its shell, but it can't ever leave and come back. It's attached. A snail is the same way. So a hermit crab, which is an arthropod, can, like a marine organism, can leave a shell. It uses old snail shells as its little house, but land snails and every other snail, sea snails, cannot leave their shell. They are attached to it just like a turtle is. So their shell grows as they grow. It's a good question.
That is great. It's kind of neat to know the differences and to know that they may seem similar on the outside, but on the inside, completely different things are going on. Okay, thank you so much, Jan. So now we're going to hear from Lisa Gonzalez, and she is our insects expert.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's our pleasure to talk about these little animals that most people don't think about, or maybe, don't have the greatest opinion about them, but this is our passion. These are animals we really love, and it's a pleasure for us to be able to talk about them and to have an audience. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Thank you for waiting while I do this. There we go. Does that look okay? Hope so. Okay, so as I mentioned, my name is, you can see it. Excellent. Good. Thank you. So my name is Lisa. I'm an assistant collections manager in the entomology department. And for my portion of the presentation, I'm going to start off much like Jan did. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to work in an entomology department, some of the day-to-day that I do, and then I am going to get into the insect portion. And as Jan had mentioned earlier, there are many insects in the world. There's about 1 million different species, so they definitely are the dominant life form if you're talking about number of species. So whenever I give a presentation about insects, it's really, really hard for me to decide what I'm going to pick because there are just so many choices and they're all really, really cool. But I decided, since I was teaming up with Jan tonight and talking with her talking about snails, that I would select insects that are in some way related to snails, like share the same space or have some kind of relationship with snails. So that's how I approached my talk tonight. So let me go ahead and start off here with some images of what it looks like when I'm in the entomology research department. So I'm actually here right now. I came into work today, even though I've also been working from home. And this is what my lab space looks like. And then also what one aisle would look like in our entomology research department. So we have over, I think, about 26 aisles that open up one at a time. We call it a compactor. And then if you look down the aisle, you can see we have hundreds of drawers. And in each drawer, we have hundreds to thousands of specimens, depending on how big or small those insects are. So the drawer that I'm holding, those are some kind of big showy beetles. But most of the insects that we work on are only a few millimeters in size. So you'd fit a whole lot more in one drawer. The photo you see where I'm standing around with a bunch of people was clearly taken before the pandemic. That was one of the last tours that I gave. So as Jen mentioned, our collection area, just like she said, it's very much like a library. It's organized in that way. And it is for researchers and for students and budding scientists to come in and use the specimens for the research purposes. But we also sometimes are able to give tours. We haven't done that in a while, but in the past, and even have some of our science camp kids come through, which is really, really a joy to be able to let them see what it's like to work in a research collection area. So our space, we have about 6 million specimens. I've been saying that same number for years, so the number is much higher. And our department started in 1913, the same time that the museum opened. And so it's just growing and growing. We keep getting more and more specimens. And so a typical work day for me, or work week, is actually kind of a hard question to answer because my job can vary so much. I mean, there's times when I do outreach, like what I'm doing right now, which I really enjoy. And before the pandemic hit, I was doing a lot of field work where I was going into yards and green spaces of people who live here in Los Angeles. So the project that I work on is called BioScan, which is short for Biodiversity, Science, City, and Nature. And what we're doing is looking for insects in Los Angeles, the full spectrum of insects in Los Angeles, because typically when you study insects living in a city, you're looking at insects that are problematic. So insects that are pests on crops, or insects that cause problems for people, things like termites or mosquitoes. And those are important insects to study, don't get me wrong, but that's a very, very small percentage of the insect diversity. So we want to know what was out there because, believe it or not, there are new species living in Los Angeles that have yet to be discovered. So the picture of me on the right, I'm using a tool called a malaise trap. It looks like a tent. And if you've ever gone camping and left your tent flap open, you know that insects will fly in and then gather up at the top. And so that's what this tent or trap actually does. The insects collect at the top and then they go into a bottle where they get preserved, and then we bring it back to the museum and then we sort it. So there's a picture of me, that's actually my setup at home for the past year, where I sort through insects, I identify them, I do specimen preparation. So if you see an insect on a pin, it had to be dried, it had to be what we call point mounted or pinned, and it had to be labeled. So I do a lot of lab tech type work, which I really, really love. If I spend an entire day staring through a microscope, no complaints. It might hurt my back, but I love it. It's so much fun. So this is sort of a typical work week for me here. And what am I looking at when I look through that microscope? Well, I'm looking at just treasures, things that most people don't get to see unless they do get to join in on a presentation like this. Because most insects in the world, and Los Angeles not being an exception, most insects are very, very small. And to fully appreciate them, you have to see them through a microscope, or you have to see a macro photograph of one. So that is part of the reason why I really got into macro photography, because I really wanted to share with the world what I had the great joy and privilege of seeing on a daily basis as I was looking through a microscope. I just feel like one of the reasons insects are underappreciated is because people just don't get to see how beautiful and interesting and complex and diverse they are. They come in so many different forms. So The image you see of the mosaic of all those insects, those are insects from Los Angeles, insects found in an average neighborhood. We didn't have to go high up into the mountains or right on the coast or go to a huge backyard or anything like that. These are insects that are very, very commonly found, even in vacant lots, even in places like an apartment complex where you might have just a small amount of green space. You can find these incredible insects, but they're mostly just really small and you have to really, really look close or see them magnified. In Los Angeles, we estimate that we have about 4,000 species of insects, but we know that number is actually low. It's probably double that. We don't really know. Jan mentioned earlier, there's about 5,000 species of mammals in the whole world. So here in LA, we probably have more, we have more species of insects than all the mammals in the world. That's just mind-blowing, I think. I included a little picture there on the left of a snail jaw. And the reason why I included this is because, as I mentioned, my work weeks can change depending on what's needed. And I had the great pleasure of collaborating with Jan. I put Dr. Vendetti on there with Jan on a project she's doing where we're looking at the differences in the morphology. That's just a fancy word for the body of a particular type of snail. We want to see if there's difference in the genetics of these different populations, and we want to compare that to the differences in their bodies. And so we're actually taking these snails and we're pulling out these teeny tiny little jaws. These snails are no longer alive. We're doing this like a dissection, and then we're taking photographs of them. And so I've been able to help do this for the past few weeks, and it's just been a great pleasure. I just love that my job, insects would be enough, but I also get to learn about so many different kinds of animals, and it's so much fun. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about some different kinds of insects. Most of the insects I'm going to talk about today live here in Los Angeles, but I'll let you know for the ones that are exceptions. And I've selected insects, like I said, that have some kind of relationship to snails. They're going to live in the same types of environments that you'd find snails in. So these are places that typically have high moisture. Typically, you're going to find them low to the ground. You're going to find them under leaf litter and in the sorts of places that you would expect to find snails. So ground beetles are a really, really interesting group of beetles. They're a large group, and what I mean by that, not just large in size, although there are some really big ground beetles, but large in terms of number of species. I was going to pull one out of we have about 100, I believe. Oh yeah, I wrote it on here. We have 100 drawers of ground beetles in our collection, and I was going to pull out a drawer of ground beetles that are from LA, but then I stumbled upon these that I took a photo of, and I just thought, oh, those are so amazing. I'm going to take a photo of this drawer. So those beetles that you see on the left are not local, but the one that you see on the right is a local one. And ground beetles are like little tigers. They're predatory. They scurry around on the ground. They have really good eyesight, and they just find something and decide they're going to eat it, and they just run after it and they grab it, and they have powerful mandibles, their mouth parts, and they just start chomping away. So you can kind of think of, like something like a lion or a tiger in insect form. And most of them will eat lots of different kinds of insects, but there is this one group, the genus Scaphonitis, that specifically prefers snails and slugs. They'll eat other things, but what they really want are those delicious, squishy snails. Must be delicious for them. And if you look at the picture, the photograph of that ground beetle, you can see its mouth part is kind of long and sticks out, and that allows it to get its snout inside of the shell of the snail and really make sure that it's getting all the good bits, all the guts and everything. So these are just really, really cool beetles. If you go out to even just a lawn that looks like it hasn't been, cared for, let's say, I don't mean that judgmentally, but I mean just like a vacant lot or something, and you look down on the ground, you'll see smaller versions of these beetles, smaller species of these ground beetles running around. So there's lots of different ground beetles living in the world and in Los Angeles. Okay, the second insect that I selected, I'm super excited. This is one of my favorite insects in LA, and I've never included it in a presentation before because I didn't fit any of the other themes, but I get to talk about it tonight. So in Los Angeles, we actually have glowworms and fireflies. And most people are not aware that we have fireflies, which I should say is a type of beetle. It's not a fly, it's a type of beetle, because our fireflies don't do that flashing that fireflies are famous for. They don't fly around and flash. Some of our fireflies here don't even glow at all when they're adults, and some of them do. And this is one that does, but it's a very low glow. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So the one on the left is the male, and then the picture on the right is the larval stage. So beetles go through metamorphosis just like butterflies, just like flies, just like ants, bees, and wasps. There are a lot of insects that go through the 4 stages of metamorphosis, where it's an egg, a larva, a pupa, and adult. The larva of this species likes to eat snails, so that's why I included it. It's actually a predator on snails and slugs. You know, what surprises me is that we don't have more animals that are preying on these snails and slugs, because snails and slugs are just, they can't really move very fast, right? Maybe Jan can comment on some of the different defenses they have. But anyway, this larva, which you can see is really beautiful. It's black and pink and just gorgeous, will prey on snails and slugs. Let me show you what the adult female looks like. I showed you what the male looks like. The female is pretty strange because she always keeps that what we call larviform state. So even as she grows into adulthood, she never changes into what we think of as an adult beetle. She always looks like a larva. There are certain insects where we see this phenomena, this interesting thing, and we're not exactly sure why that happens, but in any case, this is one example. So the female pink glowworm, this is what it looks like a little pink worm. It looks like a cartoon almost. And you can see it emits a little light. Somebody described it as a green LED light. I think that's a perfect description. It's just kind of a continuous faint glow. And this is what they do to attract their mates. They're out at night, they're giving off a little glow, and they're saying, hey, come find me. So if you look late spring, early summer, you might get lucky enough to see one. These are not very common. I don't mean to disappoint anyone. They're not as common in some of the other insects that I'm talking about today. The first time I ever saw one, I had to go up into the San Gabriel Mountains, not too far up. I was at Eaton Canyon, so I took a little hike, and I actually found one. I was with another friend of mine who also studies insects, and the two of us were squealing like little kids. We were so excited when we found it. So you do have to go a little bit outside of the city to find pink glowworms, but it's definitely worth it if you can find them. Very exciting. All right, so I actually mainly work on flies, and the other researchers, like our curator, mainly works on flies. So we're big fans of flies, and I think flies don't really get talked about a lot, not as appreciated, but flies do just about everything you could think of. Every job, if you want to say, that insects can do as pollinators and predators and scavengers, flies do this. So the flies I'm going to talk about today are called snail killing flies. It's a kind of a dramatic name. You can see on the right, I think they're quite pretty. If you take a specimen and you position it a certain way and do a portrait, I think you can make even a fly that most people would shoo away, make it look really beautiful. So it's not the adults that are feeding on snails, it's the larva, just like we talked about earlier with the pink glowworm. It's the larva of this type of fly that is going to be finding the snails. And I just love the image on this textbook. These are the great textbooks that we get to study from when we study entomology, the snail killing sciomysid flies, and that this larva looks like it's doing an evil blah, ha, 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 laugh, doesn't it? It's just, this picture I think is hilarious. So maybe it just spotted a snail and it's ready to go munch on it. So the larvae do lots of different things depending on the species. Some of them are just straight up predators. They're just going to start gobbling away. But others are a type of parasite where they're going to go inside the body of the snail or the slug and eat it from the inside out. And then eventually when they get really big, they're going to bore their way out and then consume the rest of the snail or slug. So yeah, it gets a little bit, maybe a little horrifying. Nature can be a little tough sometimes, but you know, this is what it eats. It eats snails and slugs. So why don't we move on to something that's a little bit less spooky?
So Lisa, we did have a question about the glowworms.
Okay.
Are they only found in the higher elevation of the San Gabriel Mountains?
No, they're not. I'm glad you asked that. So the time that I found one, it was hiking in Eaton Canyon, which is not high elevation. That's pretty much just right when you get to the base of the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. And it was a little bit up the trail. It wasn't even high up the trail. So you can find them in the foothill areas of the San Gabriel Mountains. You don't have to go to high elevation. It's a great question. Should I carry on?
Thanks, yes, keep going.
No,
fascinating.
Okay, so the next insect that I selected is an insect that's not local, but it just has such a great story related to snails that I really felt like it needed to be included. So mason bees are a group of bees that are solitary, meaning they don't have a queen and they don't make honey like honeybees. Honeybees are actually very unusual for bees. Most bees are solitary, live on their own. And mason bees in particular are what we call cavity nesters. So when they make their nest, they're going to go inside some kind of a natural cavity. Maybe you've heard of people setting up bee hotels where they take a piece of wood and they drill holes in it. Mason bees are one type of bee that might use a bee hotel. Well, this particular species, Osmia bicolor, which is a European to Western Asian species, does not use different types of natural cavities. It prefers snail shells, and I just think this couldn't be any cuter. So this bee will fly around after she's mated in the springtime, and she will select snail shells that are empty. So this is a snail that has died and has left behind a shell. They're not going to go and find one that's occupied and have some kind of a tussle with the snail. They're flying around and they're looking for discarded old shells, kind of like what hermit crabs do in the ocean, right? And once they find one that is about the right size, she's going to go inside and she's going to take little balls of pollen and lay a single egg on the ball of pollen and then kind of pack it inside the shell and make little individual compartments. And typically they'll do about 6 or 7 balls of pollen with an egg on each one. And then at the very end, they close it up with some pebbles and sand. So you can see that in that image at the top there. And then they will turn the shell face down to cover the opening, or if the soil is soft enough, they'll try to bury it a little bit, so that way her babies are nice and safe inside of the snail shell. And then she'll fly around and she'll find more shells, and she'll do this for something like 8 to 10 different snail shells until she's done laying all of her eggs. So this is just a really, I think, innovative use of snail shells that this particular bee uses to be able to protect her babies. And I just think it's just such a sweet story. All right, so I'm going to move on to just a couple. Let me make sure we're not going to, okay, I'll try to be a little faster. So these are some insects that are, you might recognize, that are pretty common and that you will find living in the same types of habitats as snails. They don't really necessarily have a direct relationship. They're just kind of, neighbors, just cohabitating in the same spaces. And these are ones that, I think can commonly be found in potted plants, or if you have a garden. You might not necessarily be happy to find lots of earwigs in your garden, but I'm hoping maybe just seeing a blown up picture of one might give you a little different viewpoint, because I think they're quite beautiful. And you can see the photo at the top of the earwig that is taking care of her babies. So earwigs are actually very good mothers. They have maternal care, and they will actively guard their eggs. And if anything comes around, they will fight. They're very, very protective mothers, which I appreciate that. So the name earwig, I get asked this question all the time. Why are they called earwigs? Do they crawl in people's ears? They don't crawl in people's ears. We don't really know where they got this name, but there are some possible explanations for it. And it's possible that in the past, people were sleeping on the ground, and maybe just a rare occasion, one did go in someone's ear. And that's the sort of thing that if that happens once, people will tell that story over and over again, because it's pretty shocking, right? And so maybe hypothetically, occasionally that would happen. And then from there, it was like earwigs in people's ears, and it just sort of stuck. So we think that might be where the name came from, but we don't know for sure. So another thing about earwigs, not something that you have to be worried about. I know they have those big pinchers on the back that look really formidable, and it might be something dangerous, but they can give you a little bit of a pinch that might be a little surprising, but it's not anything that's going to cut your skin. They don't have any venom. They're not injecting you with anything. That's just how they're able to protect themselves. And they feed on a variety of different things. Some of them are predators. Some of them feed on leaf litter or feed on plants. And they just like that moist environment, the same space where you would find snails. Okay, and so lastly, I wanted to talk about an insect that I think rarely gets talked about. I mean, usually when you hear insect talks, we hear about things like bees and butterflies and beetles, all amazing insects. But the springtails, they never get any attention. Springtails are one of the most ancient insects. They showed up in the fossil record over 400 million years ago. That's well over 100 million years before dinosaurs were even around. And they're still around. So that when you see a little tiny springtail, you are looking into the past. You're looking at something that is an ancient life form. I think a little bit of respect for sure is deserved. Springtails are very tiny. They're only a few millimeters in size. The one that you see next to that snail, that's a bigger one. I'm estimating that one might be like 8 to 10 millimeters in size. I'm not really sure. I'm just trying to, figure it out from the snail and the leaf there. But so that's a much bigger one. But typically they're teeny tiny. And you think about, as a comparison, think about the plankton in the ocean. So all the tiny microorganisms that are moving in the water that a lot of other things are feeding on. You could think of springtails as like plankton in the soil. So they live have to be in really moist soil, under leaf litter. Again, a lot of the same places where you would find snails, and they're feeding on really small organic matter in the soil. And so they're kind of helping to break things down in the soil. And then there's lots of things that are feeding on them because they're very soft bodied and they have to maintain a lot of moisture. So last thing, the reason why they get their name is that they actually have a little structure on the underside of their body that launches them into the air, so they can hop around in a similar way that fleas do, and that's where they get their name from. So the next time you're looking in some potting soil or just kind of looking around in leaf litter, if you see little things hopping around, those are probably springtails, and you can give them a little tip of the hat for being around for so long and being such amazing little creatures in the soil.
They're so cute, Lisa.
Aren't they adorable? They're adorable.
We do have a question.
Sure.
So what can we do to protect these insects and bugs? And also, how do the snails protect themselves from any predators that they encounter, including bugs?
Yeah, I'll let Jan answer the snail one. I mean, I have some ideas, but Jan will give you a much more thorough answer to that. But how to protect insects, I love that question, because oftentimes people ask me the opposite. They say, I want to get rid of the insects in my yard, right? So the best way to help insects is really just to provide some space for them. And the good news is that insects don't need a lot of space. They are very small animals, and so they can thrive in very small bits of green space. I mean, living in LA, I have a tiny little yard. Most people have small yards. Maybe sometimes we don't even have yards. In the past, I haven't had yards. So it can be a little difficult. But even if you just have a small patch of dirt or something undisturbed, or here's a big one. If you plant native plants, finding native plants and you're not overwatering too much, and you're providing some moisture, like some mulch, or not disturbing the soil, there's all those ways are ways to help insects to be able to thrive. So just leaving a little bit of undisturbed space for them, and planting native plants. That's actually the big one. If you're going to pick one thing, I would recommend that.
Thanks.
I'll say, so this is my last slide, just as a quick thank you to everyone. And thank you so much for all the library staff for inviting us to speak tonight. And I'll let Jan go ahead and answer that question about how snails protect themselves.
Thank you, Lisa.
That's a fantastic photo, Lisa. And for anyone who didn't see it, that was a banana slug. So Lisa's hand was next to a banana slug, which if any of you are from Northern California or down to Santa Cruz or even San Luis Obispo, you might be familiar with the biggest land slug in the world, that is banana slugs. So I think I have 3 questions. Do I have time enough to answer 3 questions?
Yes, you have time to answer a few questions. I think the first one was, how do snails protect themselves?
Yep. So
Predators?
right. So their shells, the first and maybe most obvious is that they can pull themselves into, almost all snails can fully pull themselves into their shell, and that's protecting them. And they can also climb up on, some species can climb up on structures and stick themselves to that structure and stay there, so they're out of they're not in the soil anymore, so they're not vulnerable to say beetles that are living in the soil. Slugs often have chemicals on their body, in their slime, their body slime, that those chemicals can be very unpalatable, like yucky tasting to any potential predators. And then also there was a question about what role snails and slugs play in the environment. So in terrestrial and land environments, snails and slugs are often in the decomposing cycle. So if you think about what is eating and decomposing dead or dying plant or animal matter, snails usually fill that role. So if not for snails and slugs in some environments, there would be a lot more that wasn't decomposed. So all of those like leaves and dead things wouldn't, their nutrients would not go back into the soil. I hope that did it.
Great. Yes. And I think we might have just one more question too. Okay. What is the size of a banana snail? I'm not sure if it's a banana snail or banana slug. They asked.
Yeah, I think it must be a banana slug. A banana slug can be like, if the span of from my thumb to my middle finger here is probably around 6 inches, they can be at least they can be 6 inches long, or in some cases even longer. So they are big slugs. And we also have the Southern California has the record for the largest sea slug, which is called the Black Sea Hare, and it can be in excess of 10 pounds. And it's found in our intertidal zone. Right, it's like Lisa's right. It's a big slug. So we have some really fascinating gastropods in Southern California, or in California in general.
I actually had the great excitement that we saw one just a few weeks ago at Cabrillo Beach. And unfortunately, we think this one was on its way out because it was washing up on shore, but it was huge. So yeah, that was my first time seeing one.
Wow, great. We do have another question about volunteering at the Natural History Museum. So I wonder if either of you could speak to that.
I can.
Yeah, sure. Lisa started out as a volunteer.
That's right, I did. So I don't know the most current status of a volunteer program. Our volunteer program has been on hiatus because of the pandemic, but things have been changing rapidly every week as we're getting updates from the state. So we have a page on our website about our volunteer program, and there's a lot of different opportunities for people to come and volunteer. We have people who will come and be on the floor and help to interpret, and then in some cases we have people who can volunteer behind the scenes, although those positions are a little bit more limited. But yeah, if you check our website and you just type in volunteer program or volunteer, then the information will be on there for you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you both for, let's see if there's any more questions. About a career in entomology. So not just volunteering, but specifically becoming an entomologist. So maybe what was your process, Lisa?
So I started volunteering at the museum before I decided that I was going to study entomology, because I actually wanted at first to be a science educator or be a high school teacher. And when I came to the museum, I was doing both education, outreach, and then I started volunteering in research. And that's when I realized that I really loved being behind the scenes. But when I went to UC Riverside, where I received my degree, I realized that there's so many different jobs for people who study entomology. I think most people are aware, a lot of people who do entomology do pest management. So there, that might not speak to you, but there are people who study the interactions of different types of insects, and then it gets applied to, agricultural type stuff. There are people who study medical entomology and work for the military or study mosquitoes. So there's actually, let me just say this, because there's so many insects in the world and there's so many different things that insects do, there are many different fields under the umbrella of entomology. So I would say just go online and start reading up, and then reach out to people in those specific fields, and they will answer your questions for you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Jan. So again, we have been talking with Jan Vendetti and Lisa Gonzalez from the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. And this program is brought to you by the Library Foundation and Edison International. You can look for information about our other virtual programs in our weekly virtual program e-newsletter and on the virtual programming page on our library website at lacountylibrary.org. For the latest library news and events, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Stay safe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and make sure to look down below your feet. Don't step on those snails. Don't step on those insects. Take a look at them and enjoy them. Thank you so much.